Welcome to day 4 of the 12 days of DrawPaintMas. So we are sketching and painting holly leaves and fruits today. So in this series of 12 days of DrawPaintMas, we're doing different plants and animals related to the holidays and the winter season. So we've done poinsettias, 2 turtle doves, snowy owls, and today is holly leaves. So I did want to say there's a special bonus if you finish all 12 of these activities and submit them to me. You'll get a discount on my monthly membership, the Nature Notebook Club. It'll be only $22 a month instead of $29. So I'd love to have you inside. And a lot of the subjects we're drawing in this 12 days were suggested by my students inside the club. So again, today's topic is drawing and painting holly. And this is an example of our finished product. So we are going to learn some fun facts about the holly family since I am a naturalist and I love teaching you about the backgrounds of the things that we draw and paint. And then we're going to draw and paint it. So you can use those paintings for greeting cards or gift labels or whatever you want that is inspired by the holly plant. And so here's an example of a greeting card that I made to Santa Claus using the holly leaves and flowers. So our supplies will be graphite pencils, something for highlights like a white charcoal pencil or white paint, watercolors and associated supplies. You'll want watercolor paper, scrap paper for making swatches, and viewfinders are helpful, and test swatches. As well as an envelope if you're making cards, a hair dryer if you want your paint to dry more quickly, and I used Q-tips to lift up some of my highlights. So let's get started. Today we are talking about the holly family. That's Aquifoliaceae. And here it is in flower, and here it is in fruit. So there are a lot of species. The whole family only has one genus, Ilex, and it has over 500 species. Many of them are trees and shrubs of acidic soils. They're in temperate and tropical areas around the world, except the continents of Africa and Australia. The leaves are lobed and often spiny, but not always. So pretty simple leaves, but slightly lobed in some of them with these really sharp spines. The flowers are pollinated by insects, especially bees. So that provides a really good food source for them. And the red berries, as we see here, are really important food sources for birds, although they are toxic to humans and pets and livestock. And then it includes, like I said, over 500 species, but especially you may have heard of English holly, European holly, American holly, and even the drink yerba mate is made from this family. Has anybody ever drank that before? Let's see. Christine says hello from St. Louis. And yeah, Patty says it's cold in Portland. Okay, and then so there's been a long symbolism with holly and with mistletoe, which we're drawing and painting next Saturday. And so a lot of symbolism around, Jesus Christ and, Catholicism and religion in general. In heraldry, holly is utilized to symbolize truth. And even way back in the Druid era, they held that the leaves of holly offered protection against evils, and they wore holly in their hair. And this is a historic Christmas card that includes both. Now, going next week, we're doing mistletoe. And so you might want to create something that looks like this for fun. Look at those nice cast shadows. I like that. This was from the early 1900s, I believe. Okay, and so anyway, this is what we're drawing. Now, we don't have to be super exact. I'm not going to be really, really exact, especially since we're trying to do this in 30 minutes. It's just important, when you're drawing anything, plants or animals, to kind of know the, know what's important to notice and know what is variable. So again, we've got these, this is fruiting. So we've got the berries. They're very shiny, fire engine red. And they've got these little dots at the end where the flower used to be, the petals. And then they've got this shiny pink area that we're going to lift out with a Q-tip. So, you can put as many berries as you want, but it looks good to have some overlapping others. That's what we're going to do. And then you see a little bit of this sort of purplish brown stem underneath where all of the berries are attached to the leaf area. And then we've got several leaves. You don't have to have three. Again, you can have as many as you want. The leaves have a pretty simple outline, and then they have various numbers of spines. And again, you don't have to count these and make it exact. Just notice that the leaf is, a little bit longer than wide, but not too much. So the whole leaf is kind of oval. And you see each leaf has sort of different shapes and numbers of spines. So, you can be as exact as you want or less detailed. It doesn't matter as much here. And I like people to learn how to get the essence of something that they're drawing and then be able to draw without looking at their subject and just make an approximation. And we often have to do that in the field. Okay, so let's get started. So first we're going to do the berries, then we're going to do the leaves. So let's start with those berries. And I'm going to do the top ones first. And they kind of overlap. So again, they're not really exact circles. You notice each one looks a little bit different because you might see it more from the top or from the side. They look like they're a little bit taller than wide when you see the ones on the side. And when you're drawing these, if you're trying to draw them exact, noticing those nice white negative shapes between the berries. Now I'm going to get that little stem. There's like 3 stems that kind of go to those 3 other berries on the lower right. And just, the idea of things overlapping really helps you to give a little bit of 3-dimensional form, looking like some berries are closer than others. So that's not exact, but that's good enough for our project now. Now we're going to look at this left leaf, and I'm just going to draw this midrib here. So just to get the approximate length of the leaf. And just noticing how wide the leaf is approximately. And I'm just going to go around with my pencil just once slightly and just referring to my image there and just doing a little spine and a U shape and a spine and a V shape and a spine and back down. So you don't have to feel like you have to do this exact as if it were like an orchid flower, which is very intricate and specific and detailed. Leaves are a lot more variable in plants, and they can really differ in their shapes and their colors and their numbers of these lobes and spines. Just depends on how old the plant is and if it's in the sun or shade, how healthy it is, what variety it is. Now, you noticed in one of those earlier photos that some hollies have variegated leaves. They're kind of got some white on them. But this one, the English holly, these ones have just these really deep, deep, dark green leaves. Now this third leaf, and again, just drawing the midrib. And then the edges. And I noticed I kind of made that second leaf way too narrow. So I think I will fix it a little bit because I do want to have that last leaf be going under the other one for fun. Yes, Mary Ellen, I did show a photo with the flowers, these little white, pretty simple flowers. Now I'm just double checking. That's a little closer. Okay. So now we're ready to make that third leaf. I just did want to have it go underneath. And again, kind of U shape and then a spine, V shape and a spine, da da da. Just have fun with this. And hopefully, if you were going to make these for holiday cards, after drawing this, you wouldn't even need to use the photo reference. You could just kind of riff on it with as many or as a few berries and leaves as you want, just kind of having the same idea. So you see, I'm not trying to make this a biological illustration. We're just having fun. Okay, so now we're going to start with the watercoloring. And if you're not ready for that yet, you can just watch this part or pause and just keep going on your pencil. But I'm using water and a water brush and my little viewfinders to really look at those colors. That really helps to see just how red these berries are. Pretty much a fire engine red. This is pretty easy to mix. A pretty warm red. When you're mixing colors, you want to kind of think about if it's a warm or cool version of a color. So I'm going to make a little test swatches. And that's close enough right there. So I'm lucky to do that. And I'm just going to make a big old extra swatch there so that I can play with that later. Because I always want to have something like that to be able to practice adding layers or lifting or adding colored pencils. Do you see how I'm using my Q-tip and the color lifts very easily? This isn't true with all watercolors. Some watercolors are much more staining and harder to lift. But just about anything you paint, if you get it right away, you can lift some. So I'm just going to kind of quickly paint red everywhere here and then do a little lifting with my Q-tip. My Q-tip is a little bit fat for this job, as you see. If I was painting larger, it would be easier. You know, and you could use lots of other things to lift, even a dry, clean paintbrush. But you see, I'm just trying to notice where the light is coming from. You always want to think about that when you're starting to add values or colors. And sometimes photographs are they're lit pretty flat sometimes compared to if you saw something in the field. So it's not always really easy. Or sometimes if something is photographed in a studio, they might have a photographic studio, they might have several light sources and make it a little bit more confusing. But the more you've practiced just drawing three-dimensional forms, you can just choose where you want your shadows. If you don't like where these are, as long as they're consistent. It kind of looks like the light is coming from kind of like 6 p.m. because it's on that front side of all of those berries. And if you don't have anything to lift with right now, that's okay. Sometimes you can go back in later and scrub a little bit with a wet brush to lift, or you can add highlights with a gouache or acrylic paint or charcoals or pastels. So there's lots of ways. So the local color of these berries is red, like fire engine red. But when you start thinking about shadows, I'm just going to make kind of a cooler red. And you see here when I use there we go, when I use my little viewfinder. So I'm just going to make a little bit of this cooler red and just going to dot it in some areas. Now your paint would have to be kind of dry, or you would have hopefully maybe been painting pretty dry already. Because if you try this when if you've used too much paint, those shadows will bleed into another berry. And again, you can always later on add some more details if you want with colored pencils, or once everything is dry, you can add more layers. That's what's beautiful about watercolor, is adding many transparent layers to kind of glaze and modify gently your values and your hues and the richness of your colors. So I'm just adding a little bit more layer because I was painting fairly dry. So that first layer was already dry. So I just wanted to make it a little bit richer, happier red. Again, going back in with your Q-tip or whatever other lifting tool you have. But it's those lifted kind of pinkish white highlights and the cooler red shadows that are going to make your berries look more three-dimensional. So again, don't worry if you're not really happy yet with what you've got. That's fine. Watercolors can add lots of layers. Now, while we let that dry, we're going to really look at what kind of green we need, because this is a very tricky green. I had to do this project several times to get the right green. See how dark that green is? It's almost a black. So I was using, I think I decided on olive green and a Payne's gray, but just whatever you have. A green is made of yellow and blue. So if you don't have the right green, you can play around with some yellows and blues and then add a little black or purple. It's a very dark, cold green. So whenever you're mixing colors, you want to just again think about that. Is this a cool or a warm green? And then I'll sometimes use my viewfinder, paint that right on, and now I'm super happy. I've got it exact. And then we're going to lift out those highlights because these are very shiny leaves as opposed to, oh, what? Well, like a cactus or lamb's ears. Very opposite, of course, of the little plant called lamb's ears. So now I got to make enough because this is a tricky color to make. And I'm going to practice lifting, and that works well. So you really need to make enough of this green so you're not going to have it change. So I'm going to really make a whole bunch. Again, I'm using olive green, which is kind of a muted green, and I'm using that Payne's gray. But you don't have to have those. Any basic set of paints would probably work. So because I'm right-handed and I'm kind of starting on the left and kind of dealing with this outline carefully with my nice pointed brush. And then I'll kind of fill it in. And you're going to have to be kind of careful of your berries. If they're still a little wet, they should be dry by now if you were painting dry enough, which does take a little practice. But also, I just like to start at the part of the leaf that's away from the berries as well, just in case they are still wet. And then I'm being very careful about painting around the edges of the berries again so they don't bleed. Doesn't matter so much if the red bleeds into the green, that's easier to fix. But if the green bleeds into the red, that's a little bit more of a mess. So again, just being really careful around the berries. Now, some paints can lift pretty well while they're wet, even staining paints like phthalos. But once some paint colors dry, they're impossible to lift. So that's something else you want to kind of practice and think about. I'm trying to make these spines nice and pointed. So now I am going to lift. My Q-tips are kind of fuzzy, so they're kind of too big. But you get the idea. Lifting with anything will kind of lift some colors out. And you don't have to do that lifting yet. Like if you feel like you haven't quite gotten the right green you want, you can just let your paint dry and go over it with another glaze. Once paint is really dry, you can go over it with a glaze that's a little bit milkier, kind of thicker in consistency than the first layer, so you don't lift. And you can easily modify that green. So it's pretty likely you, just like me, maybe having a hard time getting that dark enough green. And again, if it's not dark enough, the when you try to lift the highlights, they're not really going to show. Okay, so there's going to be more contrast and better highlights on that nice shiny leaf if you've got your green dark enough. So again, just kind of being careful about my edges and keeping my spines nice and sharp. Of course, I can always go back in there with a nice pointy brush like this one and lengthen those spines, or you could even lengthen the spines with a little sharp permanent ink pen. Now you see a lot of highlights. Great. Mary Ellen says you love doing leaves since they are so varied. I have been practicing this fall. Yes. Yeah. So there's no right or wrong way to do leaves. Like my maple trees have just lost the very last of their leaves, and the gardener raked them all up yesterday. But, every single leaf is totally different. So you don't have to be as focused as like, if you drew the jaguars with me, and we were trying to make the eyes be super exact and realistic. It's much easier and more fun to draw leaves because there's really no mistakes. Now, I'm not going to worry too much about the overlap of these leaves right now. I can put a little bit of highlight on that second leaf later on along those edges to lift it up. But for now, I'm just trying to get that local color of that green. What would we call this green? A Kelly green, maybe? This is very similar to what's called a pyroline green, which I do have in my set. But pyroline green is very much of a sedimentary color, and it doesn't dry very flat, which isn't as good for these shiny leaves. So I did try using a pyroline green earlier, but just didn't like the way it dried. So in watercolors, you may or may not know that there are different types. I mean, each pigment is either a staining pigment or a transparent pigment or a sedimentary pigment. So it just has to do with the original mineral or just chemical characteristics of the pigment that was used to make the paint. Now that those berries are dry a bit more, I'm going to paint between them and get that kind of reddish brown stem. And I want to paint fairly dry. So sometimes I even tap my brush on a piece of paper towel to make sure it's pretty dry. So not a lot of wet because that we don't want that paint to bleed into those berries. But this is a pretty small brush and I didn't get too much paint on there. So I was pretty successful at having them not bleed in. Plus my berries were pretty dry. So if you have a blow dryer, you could blow dry a little bit, but you do have to be careful because if your paint is really wet, then it will make the paint go someplace else. So you're not ready for this yet if your paint is wet, but I'm practicing with those little swatches I made earlier to see what kind of tool would be good for adding those veins. So there's one strong vein that goes down the middle, and then a bunch of other little veins that go out towards each of those little spiny areas. But we're not going to belabor the point too much. We just want to make a little suggestion. And again, also, if you weren't quite happy with the hue of your leaves, you could wait on this and do another glaze of a darker green. But again, always practice on swatches like those swatches I have on the left. So whenever you're painting anything, whenever I'm painting anything, at least, I have some test swatches where I'm painting a big square of a color I used so I can practice to see if that worked. Now I'm using, I decided to use a little bit of my charcoal pencil to add a little bit more highlights. And that's looking a little better. And then also, we don't want to forget the little brown spots on each of the berries. That's again where the sepals and petals were attached, and the fruit developed under that. This is inferior ovary, as they call it. And just again, looking carefully. Now you might have holly in your yard, or you might be able to buy it at the florist or the grocery store. My grocery store has a little floral department, so that might be fun for you to practice actually buying some real holly. And then I thought I would use a pencil a little bit, a kind of purplish pencil to add a little bit more shadows. So again, you could work on this a whole lot more. This is kind of just to get you started. Mine definitely could use more work, but this was actually my third attempt to do this, to get my colors right and everything. I just wasn't happy with it. Um, so you can always keep working on yours as well. Well, thanks so much for joining me today for the sketch and paint holly leaves and fruits. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll join me tomorrow for our next in our series of our 12 days of Draw Paintmas. See you then. Bye bye.